Okay, Mr. Phobes here. This is Color Concepts number 3, mini lesson number 3 on color. And we're going to cover color perception in the eye, value properties of color, saturation properties of color, the concept of color temperature and color bias, and then the interaction of color. And I thought I'd start this out with this painting by Bridget Riley Orient from 1970. If you don't know the work of Bridget Riley, look her up. She was one of the original uh, instigators of the optical illusion movement in the 1960s, and she was very interested in the way the eye perceived color and then how the mind perceives color. So the human eye. Um, you've probably seen this diagram before. This just shows the mechanics of what's going on. So light comes in through the iris, and the iris expands and contracts to, in low light situation, it opens up, letting more light in highlight situations, it contracts, letting less light. It comes through the lens, and the lens is what focuses the light onto the retina. And the retina is actually the receptor of the light. And this is where the mechanics of how light is being transferred to image is created. Uh, it is lined with millions of cells called cones and rods. The cones and rods are, you can see they're two different kinds of shapes. The cones are the color receptors, and they're sensitive to RGB color, red, green, and blue wavelength. And then the rods are sensitive to value. It requires light to see color. So when we're in low light situations, we see value. So if you think about driving at night, you don't see color very well, but you do see, you can make out shapes based on their lightness and darkness. We've seen this, but this shows again the wavelengths and how the eye is sensitive to red, green, and blue wavelengths. So that brings us to the concept of color blindness, and really the blindness is a misnomer that people have color deficiencies in color receptors. And if you look at this, you can see that uh, pro, protanopia is a color deficiency to the red wavelength, and it's pretty common in males, about 1.3% of males, and it's relatively rare in females. Uh, Deuteranopia is the deficiency in the green wavelength, and it is also pretty common in males. And then you have tritonopia, which is the deficiency to the blue. It's really, really rare in humans, and you can see that it's more rare in men than it is in females, but it's pretty uncommon. The most common one is either the deficiency to red or deficiency to green. One of the things that we've talked about, but I'd like to reiterate, is this idea of what are the prismatic colors. So those are the colors that are on the outside of the color wheel, and they're the pure colors at their highest saturation. But one of the things we want to talk about is the relationship of value to pure color. So if you look at this little scale that I've got here, it goes in chromatic order from yellow, yellow, green, green, all the way through violet and back up through yellow orange. And you can see that blue violet is our darkest of those. So each one of the specific hues has its own specific position on a value scale. We'll look at this, we'll turn it into a grayscale. So here is just a comparison. If we look at red, I've created what's called a monochromatic value scale. You're going to do that when you create the color wheel. We just won't go all the way to white. But this shows red, which is, for the most part, it's a mid-key hue, which means it's about 50% in its value range from dark to light. So if you move to the right on the red scale, you can see as I add black to it, it gets darker, and as I add white to it, it gets lighter. Um, but look at the scale below, and what I've done is I've taken the yellow through violet through yellow orange, and I brought it into Photoshop and I converted it to grayscale, and you can see the corresponding values. So if you look at the yellow, you can see that its corresponding value is almost white. If we look at violet and blue violet, their corresponding values are very, very dark. These are around probably 70 or 80%. This is just another example of if we look at red and we start breaking it into various values, how we can talk about it. So the hue red, if we think about hue, saturation, and value, the hue red is constant. The actual color is not changing. But what is changing is value and saturation. So as I add black to the color, the value gets lower, but so does the saturation. If you go to the right of the red, and as I add white to it, the value gets higher, but the saturation also gets lower. So saturation is affected by adding any pigment that is black or white or its complement. So here's some examples of a low-key chromatic value. This is a painting by my friend Peter Halas. Um, Very, very low key, and he's done a lot of paintings that are the ocean at night. And again, there's not a lot of color in this. It's dominated by blues and blue violets, but very, very dark in on it's the low key chromatic value. Mid to high key chromatic value. So here's a painting by Takashi Murakami, and you can see that it's a mix of low key, but really dominated by mid key and high key values. So if you look at that, the teeth are white or almost white, and the sky is a high key value, and most of the face is a high key. So when you mix these all together, if you put them all on a palette, you'd probably end up with something that was a mid key. So overall, kind of a mid key palette. And then we have what are called high key chromatic values. So this painting by Richard Diebenkorn is a pretty good example. He's got some mid key and lower key values in the upper right hand corner, but this is dominated by high key colors. These very pastel colors, they're all tints. They're various hues that have had white added to them.